Number 1. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer who terrorized the Pacific Northwest for nearly 2 decades before the microscopic secrets of his own DNA finally brought him to justice. Born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah, Ridgway grew up in a tumultuous household marked by a deeply controlling and frequently explosive mother who would often berate and humiliate him in front of others, laying the psychological groundwork for a seething, lifelong resentment toward women that would eventually manifest in unimaginable violence. As a young man, Ridgway struggled academically and socially, barely graduating high school before enlisting in the United States Navy, where he served a tour of duty in Vietnam before being stationed at a base near San Diego, an area notorious at the time for a thriving prostitution trade that he frequented heavily. Upon returning to civilian life in the early 1970s, he settled in the Seattle-Tacoma area of Washington state, working primarily as a truck painter at a local Kenworth truck manufacturing plant, a job he held with remarkable consistency for over 30 years, presenting to his coworkers and neighbors as an unremarkable, quiet, and deeply average family man who went to work, paid his bills, and attended church. He married 3 times, fathering a son with his second wife. But beneath this painstakingly constructed facade of suburban normalcy, Ridgway was nursing a dark and escalating compulsion, fueled by a profound misogyny and a warped religious ideology that convinced him prostitutes were unclean vessels that needed to be eliminated from the earth. His murderous campaign began in the summer of 1982, when the bodies of young women, many of whom were sex workers or vulnerable runaways, began turning up in and around the Green River in King County, Washington. The first victims, Wendy Lee Caulfield, Deborah Lynn Bonner, and Marcia Faye Chapman, were discovered in July and August of that year, discarded in or near the river like refuse, stripped of their dignity and left to the elements. Over the following months and years, the body count climbed at a terrifying pace, with victims being dumped in remote, overgrown areas, ravines, and wooded patches along the Green River, the banks of the airport, and later in secluded sites near the Cascade Mountains. The victims were typically strangled, often with a ligature, and many showed signs of post-mortem staging, leading investigators to grapple with the horrifying scale of what they were facing. By 1984, the Green River Task Force, a massive multi-agency investigative body spearheaded by the King County Sheriff's Office, had been formed, dedicating dozens of detectives to the pursuit of a killer who had already claimed more lives than the infamous Ted Bundy. Ridgway had actually come to the attention of law enforcement very early in the investigation. In 1983, a prostitute named Rebecca Gard had flagged down a patrol car and identified Ridgway as the man who had attempted to strangle her just weeks after the first bodies were discovered, and in 1984, he failed a polygraph test regarding his knowledge of the murders. However, the technology and understanding of serial predators at the time simply could not bridge the gap between suspicion and conviction, and Ridgway was repeatedly passed over as investigators chased other leads, including a highly publicized but ultimately fruitless focus on a man named Melvin Foster. As the 1980s bled into the 1990s, the killings seemed to slow down and eventually stop, leading to a grim assumption that the killer had either died, been incarcerated for other crimes, or simply moved on, leaving the families of at least 49 confirmed victims without answers and the Green River cases fading into a cold, agonizing limbo. The breakthrough that would finally shatter this decades-long silence did not come from a detective's intuition or a tip from the public, but from the relentless march of forensic science, specifically the revolutionary advancement of DNA analysis and the creation of genetic genealogy. In 2001, the King County Sheriff's Office, unwilling to let the case die, submitted semen swabs taken from the earliest victims to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory, hoping that modern techniques might yield a profile that the overwhelmed forensic capabilities of the 1980s could not. They were able to extract a full, pristine DNA profile of the killer, but when they ran it through the National Combined DNA Index System, known as CODIS, there was no match, meaning the killer had never been convicted of a crime severe enough to require his DNA to be logged. Undeterred, investigators turned to a then novel approach, forensic genetic genealogy. They contracted with a private laboratory to have the killer's DNA profile uploaded to a public genealogy database, specifically one used by individuals tracing their family trees, looking not for the killer himself, but for distant relatives whose DNA shared enough markers to point them toward a specific family surname. The results were astonishing, narrowing the suspect pool down to the Ridgway family line in the Pacific Northwest. Armed with this genealogical roadmap, detectives began quietly surveilling the extended family, eventually focusing their attention squarely back on the man they had interviewed decades earlier, Gary Ridgway. In a brilliant stroke of investigative strategy, officers placed a covert surveillance detail on Ridgway, following him to a local bar where he left behind a napkin he had used to wipe his mouth. Forensic scientists extracted DNA from the cells left on that discarded napkin and compared it directly to the semen recovered from the Green River victims. It was an absolute, incontrovertible match. On November 30, 2001, nearly 20 years after he took his first known life, Gary Ridgway was finally arrested outside his workplace in Auburn, Washington, without incident. When confronted with the DNA evidence, the quiet truck painter who had evaded the largest task force in Washington state history knew his meticulously maintained double life was over. To avoid the death penalty, Ridgway agreed to a plea bargain that stunned the nation, confessing in meticulous, chilling detail to the murders of 48 women, leading investigators to the remains of several victims who had been missing for decades, providing closure to families who had spent years in a purgatory of not knowing. In December 2003, standing in a packed courtroom surrounded by the photographs of the women he had slain, Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, receiving 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, a sentence that guarantees he will die in prison. The Ridgway case fundamentally altered the landscape of criminal investigation, proving that even the coldest of cases could be thawed by the power of genetic genealogy, a technique that has since been used to solve thousands of previously unsolvable crimes across the country. For the community of the Pacific Northwest, the resolution brought a complex mixture of profound relief and lingering sorrow, a stark reminder of the fragile lives that had been extinguished and the dark, quiet capability for evil that can reside behind the most ordinary of faces. Today, Gary Ridgway remains housed in solitary confinement at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, an elderly man stripped of the freedom he used to hunt the vulnerable, his legacy not one of triumph, but a testament to the enduring perseverance of law enforcement and the victims' families who refused to let the world forget the women who were taken by the Green River. Number 2. Lonnie David Franklin Jr., the Grim Reaper of South Los Angeles who operated in the shadows for over 2 decades, ruthlessly slaughtering vulnerable women while a community lived in paralyzing fear of an invisible phantom, until the revolutionary science of familial DNA finally ripped the mask off the killer hiding in plain sight. Born on August 30, 1950, in Los Angeles, California, Franklin was the son of a sanitation worker and grew up in the gritty, working-class neighborhoods of South Central, a region rife with systemic poverty, crime, and racial tension that would shape the backdrop of his violent reign. As a young man, Franklin exhibited a disturbing capacity for violence early on, enlisting in the United States Army where he served as an artilleryman during the Vietnam War, an experience that friends and family later noted hardened him significantly and may have accelerated an already brewing psychopathy. Following his honorable discharge, Franklin returned to Los Angeles and slid seamlessly into a series of blue-collar jobs, most notably working as a mechanic for the city of Los Angeles, a position he held for nearly 3 decades, and as a garage attendant at a police station in downtown LA, a profoundly ironic twist that placed him in daily proximity to the very officers who would eventually hunt him. To the outside world, Franklin was seen as a quiet, somewhat aloof but unremarkable neighbor who lived in a modest, neatly kept house on 81st Street, kept to himself, and occasionally played the saxophone, a hobby that sharply contrasted with the sheer brutality of his secret life. However, behind the drawn curtains of his unassuming home, Franklin was cultivating a predatory obsession with women, particularly young black women involved in prostitution or struggling with addiction, viewing them as disposable objects entirely devoid of human worth whose disappearances he believed the criminal justice system would not prioritize investigating. His confirmed killing spree began in the mid-1980s, a period when the crack cocaine epidemic was ravaging South Los Angeles, creating a tragic abundance of vulnerable targets who were easily lured into vehicles with the promise of money or drugs. The first victim officially linked to Franklin was Deborah Jackson, a 29-year-old woman found shot to death in an alley in August 1985, followed closely by Henrietta Wright in 1986, Barbara Ware in 1987, and Bernita Sparks in 1988, all discovered dumped in desolate lots, alleys, or behind dumpsters in South Los Angeles, discarded like garbage. The bodies bore a terrifying signature. The women were almost entirely naked, dumped in plain sight but hidden by the cover of darkness, and all had been killed by a single gunshot wound or, in some cases, asphyxiation, a brutal efficiency that left investigators with very little physical evidence to work with. As the bodies piled up through the late 1980s, the community's fear reached a fever pitch, and the media dubbed the unknown assailant the Grim Sleeper, a moniker born from a perceived 14-year hiatus in the killings between 1988 and 2002, a gap that led investigators to initially theorize that the killer had either died, been imprisoned, or moved away. In reality, Franklin never stopped killing. The perceived hiatus was merely an illusion created by the shifting geography of his crimes, as he began dumping bodies in alleys further south, leading detectives to mistakenly attribute the new wave of murders to a different, copycat killer. The bodies of Valerie McCorvey in 2003, and a 15-year-old girl named Princess Berthamir in 2003, who had bravely escaped a previous attack by Franklin but was tragically found deceased shortly after, shattered the illusion of the hiatus, proving that the predator was still actively hunting. Throughout the 2000s, more women turned up dead, including Lacrica Jefferson, Janicia Peters, and an unidentified woman known only as the Jane Doe, found in a garbage bin in 2009, bringing the official confirmed toll to 10 murdered women and 1 unborn child, though community activists and investigators have long suspected the true number of his victims is significantly higher, potentially reaching into the dozens. For over 2 decades, the Los Angeles Police Department deployed massive resources to catch the killer, forming dedicated task forces, canvassing neighborhoods, and interviewing hundreds of sex workers and informants. But every lead evaporated into nothing, and the case grew agonizingly cold, leaving a scar of unhealed trauma across South Los Angeles. The critical turning point in the manhunt arrived not through traditional detective work, but through a controversial and groundbreaking application of forensic science known as familial or familial search DNA analysis. In 2008, a crime scene technician reviewing old evidence from the Grim Sleeper cases managed to extract a viable, full DNA profile of the killer from saliva left on the skin of one of the victims, a microscopic trace that had been overlooked in the chaos of the initial investigations. When this profile was run through California's CODIS database, it did not return a direct match to any convicted offender, but it returned a partial match, indicating that the DNA belonged to someone who was closely related to a man already in the system, specifically a man named Christopher Franklin, who had been convicted of a serious felony weapons charge. Investigators immediately realized they were looking for a relative of Christopher Franklin, and using standard genealogical mapping, they zeroed in on his father, Lonnie David Franklin Jr. Knowing they needed a direct, court-admissible sample of Lonnie Franklin's DNA to make an arrest, the LAPD orchestrated an elaborate undercover operation straight out of a spy thriller. In July 2010, an undercover officer was dispatched to a restaurant where Franklin was known to dine, and after Franklin left the table, the officer covertly collected a piece of leftover pizza and a paper napkin that Franklin had used to wipe his mouth, securing the DNA left behind on the discarded items. Forensic scientists at the LAPD crime lab analyzed the genetic material from the pizza crust and napkin and compared it to the DNA recovered from the crime scenes. The result was an absolute, irrefutable match, conclusively proving that the quiet city mechanic was the Grim Sleeper. On July 7, 2010, heavily armed SWAT officers descended on Franklin's modest home on 81st Street, arresting the 60-year-old without resistance, and upon searching the residence, investigators uncovered a horrifying cache of evidence, including photographs of scores of unidentified women, many of whom appeared to be unconscious or deceased, along with the murder weapon. a .25 caliber handgun. The trial of Lonnie Franklin finally began in early 2016, after years of pretrial delays, and it became a highly emotional and intensely scrutinized proceeding, where prosecutors meticulously laid out the DNA evidence alongside the testimony of surviving victims who recounted the sheer terror of being in Franklin's grip. In May 2016, after a relatively brief deliberation, the jury found Lonnie David Franklin Jr. guilty of 10 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder, and the following month, the judge formally sentenced him to death, recommending that he be sent to San Quentin State Prison to await execution. The case of the Grim Sleeper sent shockwaves through the criminal justice system and the communities of South Los Angeles, sparking intense and justified outrage over the initial lack of urgency in investigating the disappearances of black women, a systemic failure that allowed Franklin to hunt with impunity for over 20 years. Community activists argued passionately, and with ample evidence, that if the victims had been affluent white women from the west side of Los Angeles, the LAPD would have deployed far greater resources far earlier, a painful truth that forced the department to confront its own historical biases and failures. Lonnie Franklin never expressed a single ounce of remorse for his crimes, maintaining a stoic, defiant silence throughout his trial and sentencing, refusing to apologize to the weeping families of the women he had destroyed. On March 28, 2020, while sitting alone in his cell on death row at San Quentin, Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was found unresponsive. Despite the efforts of medical staff to revive him, he was pronounced dead, an apparent death from natural causes at the age of 69, cheating the state out of carrying out its death sentence. For the families of the victims, Franklin's peaceful death in a prison cell was a profound insult, a bitter end to a nightmare that had spanned decades, yet the solving of the case through familial DNA provided a measure of justice that many had long believed would never come. The Grim Sleeper case stands as a watershed moment in American forensic science, demonstrating the incredible power of familial DNA searching to close the coldest of cold cases, while simultaneously serving as a dark mirror reflecting the deep, systemic inequalities in how victimhood is valued and investigated in the United States. Number 3. Samuel Little, a transient drifter who operated in the absolute margins of American society, exploiting the invisibility of vulnerable women to become the most prolific documented serial killer in United States history. His monstrous reign of terror finally unraveled not by a detective chasing a trail of bodies, but by the microscopic extraction of his DNA from a decades-old evidence locker. Born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia, Little had a deeply unstable and nomadic childhood, moving constantly with his mother as she abandoned relationships and towns with equal frequency, a rootless existence that prevented him from forming any normal human attachments and left him with a profound, simmering rage that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. He grew into a large, imposing man with a deceivingly gentle, almost grandfatherly demeanor, possessing a strange and hypnotic ability to gain the trust of the women he targeted, a chilling skill that allowed him to operate across state lines for over 3 decades without ever becoming the primary suspect in a coordinated multi-state investigation. Little's criminal history before his murder convictions was extensive, characterized primarily by petty thefts, fraud, and assaults, including a brutal attack on a woman in Florida in 1982 and a kidnapping in San Diego in 1984, crimes that resulted in prison sentences but failed to alert the authorities to the true, lethal scale of his violent nature. Throughout the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, as Samuel Little drifted through the interconnected highways and byways of America, living in a fog of alcoholism and transient existence, a string of bodies began appearing in isolated areas across the country, from the deserts of California and Texas to the swamps of Florida and the urban margins of Ohio, Missouri, and Tennessee. The victims shared a tragic and distinct profile. They were almost exclusively marginalized women, many of whom were addicted to drugs, engaged in sex work, or simply lacked a stable home, women whose disappearances were frequently ignored by local police departments who chalked them up to voluntary departures or drug overdoses. Because these women were unseen by society, their murders were investigated in isolated silos, with local coroners and underfunded police departments rarely communicating across county or state lines, a catastrophic institutional blind spot that allowed Little to kill with near total impunity. In many of these early cases, the bodies were found in advanced states of decomposition, and because Little's method of killing was uniquely difficult to detect, the deaths were routinely ruled as accidents, drug overdoses, or natural causes, essentially erasing the forensic evidence of his brutality from the official records. Little did not use guns or knives. His signature weapon was his own massive hands, which he used to ruthlessly strangle his victims, a method that, unlike stabbing or shooting, leaves no obvious external signs of trauma on heavily decomposed remains, allowing coroners to easily miss the telltale fractures in the hide bone or the microscopic hemorrhaging in the neck muscles that indicate homicidal asphyxiation. His nomadic lifestyle was perfectly suited to a killer evading detection. He hitchhiked, drove stolen cars, and slept in cheap motels, flop houses, and under bridges, moving seamlessly from one jurisdiction to another just as the bodies were being discovered, leaving no fixed address for detectives to surveil and no local footprint for task forces to track. The first major crack in the wall of silence surrounding Samuel Little's crimes appeared in 2012, when he was arrested in a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky, on a drug charge, and his DNA was subsequently run through the National CODIS database, yielding a hit that connected him to 3 unsolved murders in Los Angeles from the late 1980s. The Los Angeles Police Department immediately extradited Little to California to face charges for the murders of Carol Alford, found in 1987, Guadalupe Apodaca, found in 1988, and Audrey Nelson, found in 1989, 3 women whose deaths had languished in the cold case files for over 2 decades, their lives and deaths largely forgotten by a city focused on more sensational crimes. Prosecutors in Los Angeles built their case around the newly discovered DNA evidence, but they knew that securing a conviction against a transient drifter for crimes committed 25 years earlier would be an immense challenge, requiring them to overcome the defense's arguments that the DNA was the result of secondary transfer or contamination. In September 2014, Samuel Little stood trial for the murders of Alford, Apodaca, and Nelson, and the prosecution presented a meticulous case linking his DNA to the victims, alongside testimony from a woman who had miraculously survived one of his attacks in 1982. Providing a harrowing first-hand account of his method of strangulation and his chillingly calm demeanor during the assault. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before finding Samuel Little guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder, and the judge sentenced him to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, a verdict that was widely celebrated by the detectives who had worked tirelessly to bring him to justice. However, what happened next elevated the Samuel Little case from a standard cold case conviction into one of the most extraordinary chapters in the history of American criminal justice, as the true, staggering magnitude of his crimes began to emerge from the shadows of his own confession. In 2018, having been transferred to a Texas prison to face additional charges for the 1994 murder of Denise Brothers in Odessa, Little was approached by a highly specialized investigator from the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, known as VICAP, an agent named James Holland who had spent months building a rapport with the aging killer. Holland, recognizing that Little craved attention and validation for his intellect and his perceived superiority over law enforcement, engaged him in a series of extensive, recorded interviews, treating him not as a monster to be condemned, but as a storyteller whose memories needed to be documented, a psychological strategy that completely disarmed Little's defenses. In a stunning revelation that shocked even the most seasoned FBI profilers, Samuel Little confessed to the murders of 93 women across 19 states and over a 35-year period, a number that, if verified, would make him the most prolific serial killer in American history, surpassing the likes of Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and Jeffrey Dahmer combined. The FBI launched a massive, multi-jurisdictional initiative to verify Little's confessions, cross-referencing the incredibly specific details he provided about the locations, dates, and physical descriptions of his victims with unsolved homicides, missing persons reports, and unexplained death certificates scattered in archives across the country. What they discovered was both astonishing and deeply disturbing, In case after case, Little provided details that only the killer could have known, leading investigators to exhume bodies, change official death certificates from natural causes or overdoses to homicides, and notify families who had spent decades believing their daughters and sisters had simply succumbed to addiction. The verification process relied heavily on the very forensic pathology that had failed to catch him the first time around, as medical examiners went back to old autopsy reports and, in many cases, re-examined skeletal remains, finding the previously overlooked fractures in the neck bones that confirmed Little's method of strangulation. To date, the FBI has officially corroborated over 60 of Little's 93 confessions, a staggering number that continues to rise as investigators work through the massive backlog of cases he detailed, and the Bureau has publicly released dozens of sketches drawn by Little himself, haunting portraits of women whose identities remain unknown, hoping that someone, somewhere, will recognize a face and finally give a name back to the dead. The legal outcome for Samuel Little was already sealed by his life sentences in California, but the confessions he provided to the FBI resulted in additional guilty pleas for murders in Texas, Missouri, and other states, actions taken primarily to ensure that the families of those specific victims received the official legal closure of a conviction. Samuel Little died on December 30, 2020, at the age of 80, in a hospital bed inside a Colorado prison, where he had been transferred for medical treatment, taking whatever secrets he still possessed to the grave and leaving behind a dark, devastating legacy that forced America to confront the horrifying cost of its indifference to its most vulnerable citizens. The case of Samuel Little is not just a story about a killer, but a searing indictment of a criminal justice system that historically deprioritized the deaths of marginalized women, allowing a monster to hunt in plain sight for over 3 decades simply because the society he inhabited did not value the lives he was taking. The use of DNA to initially snare Little, followed by the FBI's unprecedented effort to match his confessions to forgotten cases, has fundamentally reshaped how law enforcement handles missing and murdered persons cases, demonstrating that every human life, no matter how marginalized, deserves the full weight of forensic and investigative resources. Number 4. Altemio Sanchez, a respected family man and professional employee who hid a dark, violent sexual compulsion behind a meticulously constructed facade of suburban normalcy for over a quarter of a century, terrorizing the women of Buffalo, New York. As the elusive bike path rapist before advanced DNA technology finally stripped away his disguise and forced the community to reckon with the monster living quietly in its midst. Born on January 19, 1951, in Sabana Grande, Puerto Rico, Sanchez immigrated to the United States with his family as a young child, settling in the rough and tumble neighborhoods of Buffalo's West Side, a working-class enclave defined by its dense ethnic communities, close-knit families, and the sprawling, secluded greenways that cut through the industrial landscape. To everyone who knew him, Sanchez was the embodiment of the American dream realized. He married his high school sweetheart, raised 2 sons, maintained a stable job as a mechanical inspector at a local brewery for over 30 years, attended church regularly, coached youth baseball, and was widely regarded by his neighbors as a quiet, helpful, and entirely unremarkable presence. This flawless public persona was a critical component of his ability to evade capture, as it created an impenetrable psychological barrier for investigators who were searching for a deviant sexual predator, a profile that in no way matched the devoted father and steady employee they saw when they looked at Altemio Sanchez. However, beneath the surface of this ordinary life, Sanchez was nursing a deeply sadistic and predatory obsession that began to manifest violently in the early 1980s, a compulsion that he carefully compartmentalized, allowing him to switch between the roles of loving husband and terrifying rapist with a chilling, almost mechanical precision. His reign of terror began in the shadows of Buffalo's extensive network of bicycle and jogging paths, particularly the scenic but isolated trails along the Niagara River and Black Rock Canal, areas that were popular with joggers, cyclists, and walkers during the day but became deeply menacing corridors of fear as the sun went down. The first known attack attributed to Sanchez occurred in 1981, when a young woman was grabbed from behind while jogging on a secluded path, brutally sexually assaulted, and left bound and gagged in the underbrush, a terrifying ordeal that local police initially treated as an isolated incident, unaware that a serial predator had just claimed his first territory. Over the next several years, the attacks escalated in both frequency and brutality, with at least a dozen women reporting being ambushed on the bike paths by a masked white male, typically wearing a hooded sweatshirt, who would blindfold them, bind their hands, and sexually assault them in the dark before vanishing into the night without a trace. The victims' descriptions were remarkably consistent, depicting an attacker who was methodical, calm, and eerily controlled, a man who seemed to take pleasure not just in the physical violation of his victims, but in the psychological terror he inflicted, whispering threats and maintaining a terrifying, quiet dominance throughout the assaults. By the mid-1980s, the Buffalo Police Department had recognized the pattern and officially acknowledged that a single serial rapist was hunting women in their city, dubbing him the Bike Path Rapist, a moniker that instantly gripped the region in a state of paralyzing fear and fundamentally altered the way women navigated their own community. Task forces were formed, undercover female officers were deployed as decoys along the trails, and composite sketches were distributed to every media outlet in western New York. But despite the massive allocation of police resources, the Bike Path Rapist remained a phantom, striking with impunity and vanishing without leaving a single identifiable clue at the crime scenes. The investigation was further complicated by a tragic misdirection in 1984, when a man named Anthony Capozzi was arrested and charged with 2 of the bike path rapes based on eyewitness identification, a conviction that effectively shut down the active manhunt for the real predator and allowed Sanchez to continue his violent spree with the false assurance that the police were looking in the wrong direction. Then, the violence escalated from sexual assault to outright murder, a terrifying evolutionary step that suggested the rapist's urges were becoming more lethal and that the women of Buffalo were now facing a killer, not just a rapist. In September 1990, a 32-year-old woman named Linda Yalom, a University at Buffalo student, was found strangled to death on a bike path near the Ellicott Creek Bike Trail, her body discovered in a wooded area just yards off the paved path, sending a shockwave of pure terror through the community and transforming the bike path rapist into a murderer. 2 years later, in September 1992, the body of 22-year-old Majane Mazur was discovered in a similarly isolated area near the Tonawanda bike path, strangled and left exposed to the elements, confirming the worst fears of law enforcement and the public that the predator had added homicide to his repertoire. For over a decade after the Mazur murder, the killings seemingly stopped, leading investigators to theorize that the killer had either died, been incarcerated for an unrelated crime, or simply lost the physical capacity to carry out the attacks, leaving the cases to grow cold and the families of Yalom and Mazur to endure years of agonizing uncertainty. However, in January 2006, the nightmare returned with a vengeance when the body of 45-year-old Joan Diver, a suburban mother and wife who had been out for a walk on a bike path in the town of Amherst, was discovered strangled in a wooded area near the trail, a murder that instantly resurrected the specter of the bike path rapist and launched a massive, renewed investigative effort by a newly formed task force equipped with tools that did not exist in the 1980s and 1990s. This time, the investigators had a weapon that would prove decisive: advanced DNA analysis. Semen recovered from the bodies of Linda Yalom, Majane Mazur, and several of the earlier rape victims had been meticulously preserved in the Buffalo Police Department's evidence lockers for years, waiting for the day when science would catch up to the evidence. In 2006, the New York State Police Forensic Investigation Center was able to extract full, incontrovertible DNA profiles from the preserved evidence, and when they ran the profiles through the National CODIS database, they confirmed what many had long suspected but could never prove. The same man who had been raping women on the bike paths in the 1980s was the same man who had murdered Yalom, Mazur, and Diver. The DNA profile of the killer was now firmly established, but it did not match anyone in the convicted offender database, meaning the killer had never been caught for a crime that required DNA submission, a dead end that would have stalled the investigation in previous decades but was merely a hurdle in the age of forensic genetic genealogy. Investigators turned to the cutting-edge technique of familial DNA searching, a process that involved comparing the killer's DNA profile to the database to look for near matches, individuals who shared a significant portion of the genetic markers but were not direct matches, indicating they were close relatives, such as siblings, parents, or children, of the perpetrator. The search yielded a critical hit. The DNA profile of the bike path killer closely matched the DNA of a man who was already in the system, a man who turned out to be the son of Altemio Sanchez. This single, groundbreaking genetic connection allowed investigators to immediately focus their attention on the Sanchez family, and when they began digging into the background of the 55-year-old brewery inspector, the pieces of the puzzle started falling into place with terrifying speed. Detectives placed Sanchez under intensive physical and electronic surveillance, monitoring his movements, his routines, and his habits, and they quickly noticed that he frequently drove near the bike paths where the attacks had occurred, a behavioral pattern that aligned perfectly with the geographic profile of the killer. The decisive break came when investigators managed to obtain a direct DNA sample from Sanchez without his knowledge, collecting his discarded DNA from a cup he had used at a local restaurant during a surveillance operation, and when the forensic lab compared the DNA from the cup to the DNA recovered from the crime scenes, the result was an absolute, undeniable match. On January 15, 2007, nearly 26 years after his first known attack, Altemio Sanchez was arrested outside his workplace by a team of Buffalo police detectives and FBI agents, a moment that stunned his family, his co-workers, and an entire city that had spent decades looking over its shoulder for a monster who was living in a modest house on a quiet street in a Buffalo suburb. The fallout from Sanchez's arrest was immediate and far-reaching, beginning with the exoneration of Anthony Capozzi, the man who had been wrongly convicted of the 1983 bike path rapes and had spent 22 years in prison for crimes committed by Sanchez. A horrific miscarriage of justice that was directly attributable to the police's failure to catch the real killer and their over-reliance on flawed eyewitness testimony. Capozzi was formally exonerated and released from prison in April 2007, just 3 months after Sanchez's arrest. A bittersweet victory for a man who had lost decades of his life to a wrongful conviction, and the case became a powerful catalyst for criminal justice reform in New York State regarding eyewitness identification procedures. Faced with the overwhelming, incontrovertible weight of the DNA evidence linking him to the rapes and murders, Altemio Sanchez chose to avoid a trial and pleaded guilty in January 2007 to 3 counts of second-degree murder for the killings of Yalom, Mazer, and Diver, as well as multiple counts of rape and kidnapping related to the earlier attacks on the bike paths. During his emotional sentencing hearing, Sanchez stood before the court and offered a brief, heavily scripted apology to the victims' families, and statement that was universally dismissed as hollow and self-serving by the packed courtroom, which included weeping family members and the detectives who had spent years hunting him. The judge sentenced Sanchez to 75 years to life in state prison, a sentence that ensured the bike path rapist would never again set foot in the community he had terrorized, and he was subsequently transferred to the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision, where he will remain until his death. The Altemio Sanchez case stands as one of the most compelling examples in American criminal history of the power of familial DNA technology to solve decades-old cold cases. But it also serves as a profoundly disturbing reminder of the incredible capacity for deception that exists within the human psyche, and the terrifying reality that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who look and act exactly like everyone else. Number 5. Dennis Rader, a church-going municipal employee who meticulously crafted an illusion of absolute normalcy in the heartland of America while secretly operating as a self-anointed executioner under the chilling moniker BTK, binding, torturing, and killing 10 innocent people over a 17-year period. His eventual capture orchestrated not by a brilliant deduction from a detective on his trail, but by a fatal, egotistical miscalculation that led directly from a haunting communication back to the microscopic trail of his own DNA. Born on March 9, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas, Rader spent his formative years in the small, conservative town of Wichita, where he was raised in a deeply religious household that emphasized strict adherence to rules and a rigid moral code, an environment that ironically provided the perfect camouflage for the dark, sadistic fantasies that were taking root in his mind from a very young age. As a child and teenager, Rader exhibited classic warning signs of a predatory psychopath that were entirely missed or dismissed by those around him, including a disturbing fascination with torturing and killing small animals, a compulsion to spy on women, and a habit of wearing women's underwear beneath his clothing, secretive behaviors that he carefully concealed from his family and peers. Rader joined the United States Air Force in the mid-1960s, serving for 4 years as a mechanic and radio operator, an experience that instilled in him a rigid, militaristic discipline that would later define the methodical, almost bureaucratic approach he took to planning and executing his murders. Upon returning to civilian life, he married a woman named Paula Dietz in 1971, settled in the Park City neighborhood just north of Wichita, and began building what appeared from the outside to be a stunningly ordinary Midwestern life, earning an associate's degree in administration of justice, a darkly ironic educational choice, and securing a job as an ordnance enforcement officer. Essentially a code compliance officer for the city of Wichita. In this role, Rader was responsible for ensuring that local residents adhered to municipal regulations regarding animal control, property maintenance, and zoning laws, a position of minor authority that he relished and that allowed him to exercise control over his neighbors under the guise of civic duty, a psychological dynamic that closely mirrored the absolute control he sought over the lives of his victims. Rader also became an active and highly visible member of his local Lutheran church, serving as the president of the church council, a deacon, and a lay leader. Roles that placed him at the very center of the community's moral and social fabric and provided him with an unassailable cover of respectability that made it virtually impossible for anyone to imagine him capable of the horrors he was committing in the shadows. His violent fantasies, which he had harbored since childhood, finally escalated into horrific reality on January 15, 1974, when Rader broke into a home in East Wichita and murdered 4 members of the Otero family: 38-year-old Joseph Otero, his 34-year-old wife Julie, and 2 of their children, 9-year-old Josephine and 11-year-old Joseph Jr. In a burst of unimaginable brutality that shocked the normally quiet city to its core. Rader had stalked the family for weeks prior to the attack, watching their routines and identifying the vulnerabilities in their home's security, and when he finally made his move, he cut the phone lines, brandished a handgun, and systematically bound, tortured, and strangled each family member, leaving their bodies in grotesque, posed positions that reflected his twisted, sadistic need for absolute dominance. The Otero murders were immediately classified as a major homicide investigation, and the Wichita Police Department, lacking any experience with crimes of this magnitude, was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of physical evidence and the terrifying randomness of the attack, a chaotic crime scene that provided few immediate leads and no clear motive. Emboldened by the lack of progress in the investigation, Rader struck again in April 1974, murdering 21-year-old Catherine Bright in her home, a crime that went disastrously wrong for him when Bright fought back with incredible ferocity, forcing Rader to flee before he could fully enact his ritualistic fantasies, a rare failure that left behind a witness, Bright's brother Kevin, who survived a gunshot wound and provided the first physical description of the killer. It was after this second attack that Rader made the first of a series of catastrophic psychological errors that would ultimately seal his fate, a decision driven not by necessity, but by an insatiable, narcissistic need for recognition and attention from the very authorities he was trying to evade. In 1974, Rader anonymously sent a letter to the Wichita Eagle-Beacon newspaper and the local police department, claiming responsibility for the Otero and Bright murders and providing specific, chilling details about the crimes that only the perpetrator could have known, a communication that also included a chilling new moniker for himself, BTK, standing for bind them, torture them, kill them. This decision to initiate direct contact with the police and the media was the act of an egomaniac who viewed the investigation as a game, a chess match between himself and the detectives, a dynamic that would characterize his entire criminal career and ultimately provide the thread that would unravel his decades-long web of deception. Over the next several years, Rader continued to kill sporadically, murdering 26-year-old Shirley Vian in March 1977, holding her and her 3 young children hostage in their home before binding and strangling her while the terrified children listened from an adjacent room, a crime that demonstrated his complete immunity to the suffering of innocent children. In December 1977, he murdered 25-year-old Nancy Fox, a case in which he made another critical error by making a phone call to a police dispatcher from a local business, a call that was traced back to a specific location but failed to definitively identify him, leaving investigators with another frustratingly close but ultimately unproductive lead. Rader's killing spree continued into the 1980s with the murders of 62-year-old Maureen Hedge in April 1985, 53-year-old Vicky Wegerle in September 1986, and 28-year-old Dolores Davis in January 1991, each crime demonstrating a highly refined and ritualized methodology that involved extensive stalking, elaborate bindings using materials he brought to the scene, and a post-mortem posing of the bodies that reflected his desire for absolute, frozen control. After the 1991 murder of Davis, Rader suddenly went silent, ceasing all communications with the police and media and, apparently, ceasing his killings, a period of dormancy that stretched for over a decade and led many in the Wichita community and law enforcement to believe that the BTK strangler had either died, been incarcerated for other crimes, or simply lost the physical capacity or psychological drive to kill. The reality was that Rader had simply become more disciplined and more patient, continuing to live his double life as a church leader and city employee while meticulously cataloging his past crimes in journals, photographs, and sketches, a private archive of horror that he kept hidden in his home, feeding his narcissism in private rather than seeking public validation. However, the narcissistic hunger that had driven him to communicate with the police in the 1970s never truly disappeared, and in March 2004, after 13 years of silence, Rader reignited his twisted game by sending a letter to the Wichita Eagle, enclosing a photocopy of the driver's license of Vicky Wegerle, one of his victims, along with a word puzzle that contained hidden messages about his identity and his crimes. This communication sent a shockwave of terror through Wichita, a city that had largely moved on from the BTK nightmare, and it triggered a massive, renewed investigative effort by the Wichita Police Department, now led by a new generation of detectives who were armed with forensic tools that did not exist when the first murders were committed. Over the following months, Rader engaged in an increasingly brazen and reckless correspondence with the police and the media, sending packages that contained items from the crime scenes, detailed sketches of his victims, and letters outlining his desire to be recognized and understood. A torrent of communications that provided investigators with an avalanche of new evidence, but also demonstrated that the killer was becoming increasingly desperate for attention. The critical turning point in the investigation arrived in a package Rader sent to a local television station in May 2004, a package that contained a floppy disk, a piece of technology that Rader, despite his meticulous planning, mistakenly believed was entirely anonymous and untraceable. Wichita police turned the disk over to their forensic computer analysts, who immediately discovered that the disk contained a deleted Microsoft Word document that had been authored by someone using the username Christ Lutheran Church, a piece of metadata that pointed directly and exclusively to the church where Dennis Rader served as president. This single piece of digital evidence was the Rosetta Stone of the case, allowing investigators to immediately focus their attention on Rader, and once they identified him as the primary suspect, the final, decisive phase of the investigation relied entirely on the power of modern DNA technology. Detectives obtained a court order compelling Rader's daughter, Carrie Rawson, to provide a DNA sample, a strategic move designed to determine if her familial DNA matched the DNA profile that investigators had been able to extract from trace evidence recovered from the BTK crime scenes over the years. The forensic analysis of the daughter's DNA revealed a conclusive familial match to the crime scene DNA, confirming beyond any scientific doubt that the biological father of Carrie Rawson was the BTK strangler, a devastating revelation that linked the monster directly to the family man sitting in the church pew. On February 25, 2005, a team of heavily armed police officers descended on the Park City home of Dennis Rader, arresting the 60-year-old without incident as he was driving away from his home, an act of absolute normalcy that he maintained even as the trap was closing around him. During hours of intense interrogation following his arrest, Rader, having been stripped of the power and control that defined his existence, completely abandoned his carefully constructed facade and confessed in graphic, unemotional detail to all 10 murders, walking investigators through each crime with the cold, bureaucratic precision of a man filing a report. He explained his motivations with a chilling clarity, describing the acts of binding, torturing, and killing as Factor X, a mysterious, irresistible internal force that he claimed compelled him to commit the murders to achieve a state of psychological satisfaction and sexual release that he could not obtain through any other means. In June 2005, Dennis Rader pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder in a highly dramatic, nationally televised court hearing where he recounted the details of each killing in a calm, detached, almost conversational tone, a performance that horrified the packed courtroom and provided a terrifying glimpse into the mind of a completely remorseless psychopath. The judge sentenced Rader to 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, a sentence that was mandated by Kansas law, which did not have the death penalty at the time the murders were committed, a legal technicality that prevented the state from executing the man who had terrorized Wichita for 3 decades. Today, Dennis Rader is serving his sentence in solitary confinement at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, an elderly man who spends his days in a tiny cell, stripped of the power, control, and public recognition he so desperately craved, his legacy a permanent stain on the city he hid within. The BTK case remains one of the most disturbing and instructive in the history of American criminal justice, demonstrating the terrifying capability of psychopathic individuals to camouflage themselves within the most respected institutions of society, and serving as a testament to the extraordinary power of modern forensic science, from digital metadata analysis to familial DNA matching, to finally bring the longest-running games of a serial killer to a definitive and humiliating end. Number 6. Chester Dwayne Turner, a brutal and deeply prolific serial killer who prowled the desperate streets of South Los Angeles for over a decade, strangling women with his bare hands and leaving their bodies in the shadows of alleyways and vacant lots. A lethal predator who managed to slip through the fingers of the criminal justice system not just once, but twice, before the relentless, meticulous retesting of decades-old DNA evidence finally exposed the horrifying scope of his crimes, and forced a massive, agonizing reckoning for a system that had failed his victims. Born on November 5, 1966, in Warren, Arkansas, Turner's early life was characterized by profound instability and neglect, a dysfunctional upbringing that set him on a path of petty criminality and violence from a young age, culminating in his relocation to South Los Angeles as a teenager, where he seamlessly blended into the gritty, marginalized environment that would become his hunting ground. Turner was not a criminal mastermind. He was a large, physically imposing man with a low IQ and a history of low-level arrests for drug possession, petty theft, and assault, a frequent flyer in the Los Angeles County criminal justice system who was viewed by law enforcement as a common, low-level nuisance rather than a lethal threat. A catastrophic misjudgment that allowed him to operate with absolute impunity for over 11 years. His known killing spree began in March 1987, when the body of 29-year-old Diane Johnson was discovered in an alley in South Los Angeles, strangled to death and left partially clothed, a grim tableau that would be repeated with horrifying consistency over the following decade as Turner honed his method of killing to a dark, brutal efficiency. Over the next 11 years, between 1987 and 1998, Turner systematically hunted vulnerable women, primarily black women who were involved in prostitution or struggling with severe drug addiction, targets he selected precisely because he knew their disappearances would not generate the intense, immediate manhunts that the murders of more affluent or socially connected victims would provoke. The victims, including Annette Ernest, Annette May, Priscilla Price, Mary Edwards, Deborah Williams, and others, were found dumped in alleys, behind dumpsters, in vacant lots, and inside abandoned buildings across a tightly concentrated geographic area of South Los Angeles, a pattern that should have alerted investigators to the presence of a single, highly active serial killer but was instead tragically attributed to the general, ambient violence of the era. Turner's method of killing was intimate and violent. He did not use weapons, preferring to use his hands to strangle his victims, a method that reflected his raw physical power and his desire for direct, overpowering contact, and a method that, unlike the use of a knife or gun, left behind very little obvious forensic evidence at the chaotic, outdoor crime scenes that were often contaminated by the elements, animals, and the sheer volume of foot traffic in the urban environment. As the bodies piled up through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the Los Angeles Police Department was overwhelmed by the staggering homicide rate in South Los Angeles, a period when the crack cocaine epidemic was devastating the community and murder had become a tragically routine occurrence. A perfect storm of systemic failure and resource depletion that created a massive investigative blind spot directly over Turner's killing field. Detectives investigated the murders individually, failing to connect the forensic dots between the strangled bodies being discovered in their respective divisions, a siloed approach that was exacerbated by the lack of a centralized, computerized system for tracking serial homicides across the sprawling geography of Los Angeles. A critical institutional failure that allowed Turner to simply slip between the cracks. In 1994, the nightmare took an even more devastating turn when Turner murdered 33-year-old Elandra Bunn, who was pregnant at the time of her death, and 26-year-old Regina Washington, who was also pregnant, crimes that added the horrific charge of double murder to his eventual ledger and deepened the profound tragedy of his reign of terror. Throughout this entire period, Turner was not operating in the shadows as an invisible ghost. He was a known entity to the police, having been arrested multiple times for various offenses, including a 1992 arrest for felony assault that required him to provide a DNA sample to the state of California, a sample that, due to the massive backlog in processing and the primitive state of the state's DNA database at the time, sat untested and unconnected to the mounting pile of bodies for years. The first catastrophic failure of the system to stop Turner occurred in 1994, when he was arrested for the rape of a woman in South Los Angeles, a violent crime that should have resulted in a prison sentence of decades, but instead, incredibly, Turner was acquitted of the rape charge at trial, a devastating miscarriage of justice that returned a known violent predator back to the streets where he continued to kill with impunity. Even more horrifyingly, in 2002, a man named David Allen Jones, who had a history of mental illness and was a convenient, vulnerable target for a desperate police department, was wrongfully arrested and convicted for 3 of the murders that would later be definitively linked to Chester Turner through DNA evidence. Jones spent 11 years in prison, enduring the living hell of a wrongful conviction for serial murder, before being exonerated and released in 2004. A tragic injustice that was a direct result of the LAPD's failure to properly process the forensic evidence in the case and their over-reliance on coerced, unreliable confessions from a mentally compromised individual. The true turning point in the hunt for Chester Turner did not arrive through a brilliant investigative leap or a tip from the public, but through the slow, painstaking, and deeply unglamorous work of forensic science. Specifically, a decision by the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office to go back and retest thousands of untested rape kits and DNA samples from unsolved homicides that had been sitting in evidence lockers for years. A massive, systematic effort to apply modern technology to the cold cases of the past. In 2004, a forensic scientist at the LAPD crime lab was retesting biological evidence recovered from the body of a victim murdered in 1997. And using advanced DNA extraction techniques that were not available in the 1990s, they were able to develop a full, pristine DNA profile of the killer. When this profile was run through the California DNA database, which had been significantly expanded and modernized since Turner's last arrest, it returned a direct, incontrovertible match to Chester Dwayne Turner, whose DNA had finally been entered into the system from a prior felony conviction, a match that instantly transformed a collection of isolated, cold homicides into the case of one of the most prolific serial killers in Los Angeles history. Armed with the DNA match, investigators immediately obtained a warrant for Turner's arrest, and on April 11, 2004, Chester Dwayne Turner was taken into custody without incident at a residential facility in Los Angeles where he was living, an unremarkable end to a decades-long reign of terror that had claimed the lives of at least 12 women and 1 unborn child. As the forensic net widened, the DA's office systematically retested evidence from every unsolved strangulation of a woman in South Los Angeles during the relevant time period, and the results were staggering. Turner's DNA was linked to 12 separate murders. An astonishing number that solidified his status as one of the most lethal serial killers in the history of a city that had unfortunately produced more than its share. In 2007, Turner stood trial for the murders of 10 of his victims, and the prosecution presented an airtight, devastating case built entirely on the foundation of DNA evidence, a scientific certainty that left the jury with absolutely no doubt about his guilt, a stark contrast to the flawed, circumstantial cases that had wrongfully imprisoned men like David Allen Jones in the past. The jury deliberated for less than a single day before finding Chester Dwayne Turner guilty on all 10 counts of first-degree murder, and the judge sentenced him to death, a verdict that was widely seen as a necessary measure of justice for the 12 women whose lives had been extinguished and discarded. However, the legal odyssey did not end there, as in 2014, the DA's office, continuing its exhaustive review of cold case evidence, announced that additional DNA testing had linked Turner to 2 more murders, those of 32-year-old Cynthia Annette Johnson in 1987 and 30-year-old Mary Edwards in 1992, bringing the official, confirmed death toll to 12. Turner was brought back to court, convicted of the 2 additional murders, and again sentenced to death, a procedural formality at that point, but one that carried immense symbolic weight for the families of the victims who had waited decades to see the man who stole their loved ones held accountable in a court of law. The case of Chester Dwayne Turner is not just a story about a serial killer, but a searing, devastating indictment of a criminal justice system that systematically failed the most vulnerable members of its community on multiple, compounding levels, from the initial failure to connect the forensic evidence across jurisdictional lines, to the catastrophic wrongful conviction of David Allen Jones, to the staggering delay in processing the DNA sample that could have stopped Turner years earlier. For the families of the victims, the resolution of the case brought a profoundly complex mixture of relief, vindication, and deeply rooted anger, a recognition that while science had finally delivered justice, the system itself had failed to protect their daughters, sisters, and mothers when they were alive, a failure that can never be fully rectified by a death sentence. Today, Chester Dwayne Turner remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison, his appeals slowly winding through the California judicial system, a fate that, while legally appropriate, can never come close to equaling the terror, pain, and suffering he inflicted on the streets of South Los Angeles during his 11-year reign of terror, a dark chapter in the city's history that was finally closed not by a detective's intuition, but by the unwavering, objective truth of DNA. Number 7. Michael Gargiulo, a charismatic and deeply cunning predator who masqueraded as a friendly, helpful neighbor in the glittering, celebrity-studded enclaves of Los Angeles, all while prowling the darkened streets and vulnerable entryways of apartment buildings as a knife-wielding killer, his terrifying double life as the Hollywood Ripper finally dismantled not by a witness or a fingerprint, but by the microscopic extraction of his DNA from a crime scene that had sat frozen in time for over a decade. Born on February 15, 1976, in the small town of Glen Ridge, New Jersey, Gargiulo's early life was steeped in dysfunction and violence, an environment that normalized aggression and deceit and shaped him into a deeply manipulative individual who learned at a young age how to read people and exploit their vulnerabilities to get what he wanted. As a teenager, Gargiulo displayed a disturbing pattern of escalating criminal behavior, including arrests for theft and a violent assault, but he possessed a natural, almost chameleon-like ability to charm those around him, presenting a clean-cut, affable, and eager-to-please exterior that completely masked the dark, violent compulsions simmering just beneath the surface. In the late 1990s, Gargiulo left New Jersey and relocated to Southern California, drifting through the sprawling suburbs of the San Fernando Valley and eventually settling into the shadow of Hollywood, a landscape of transients, aspiring actors, and beautiful dreamers that provided the perfect hunting ground for a sociopath who understood how to blend into a crowd and disappear without a trace. To his roommates, friends, and neighbors, Gargiulo was the quintessential good guy, a garrulous, outgoing man who worked as an air conditioning and heating technician, a job that required him to enter people's homes and gave him a legitimate reason to be in any neighborhood at any time of day or night, a professional cover that was absolutely ideal for a predator scouting for victims. He was known for bringing food to his neighbors, offering to fix their appliances, and striking up conversations in the hallways of the apartment complexes where he lived, a hypersocial, almost aggressively friendly persona that served the critical dual purpose of making him invisible as a suspect and providing him with intimate knowledge of the daily routines, habits, and vulnerabilities of the women who lived within earshot of his own apartment. However, behind this carefully constructed mask of suburban helpfulness, Gargiulo was operating as a nocturnal stalker and killer, driven by a deeply rooted, sadistic compulsion to hunt, attack, and violently stab women, a fixation on penetration by a blade that forensic psychologists would later describe as a clear, violent substitution for sexual intimacy. A compulsion so overwhelming that it eventually drove him to kill with escalating frequency and breathtaking recklessness. The first crime definitively linked to Gargiulo occurred far from Hollywood, in the quiet suburb of Arlington Heights, Illinois, where, in 1993, an 18-year-old woman named Tricia Picacho was found stabbed to death on the back porch of her family home, a brutal, seemingly random attack that shattered the safety of the community and left local police with virtually no leads. At the time, Gargiulo was a teenager living in the area, and he had been a friend of Picacho's brother, a connection that placed him loosely within the orbit of the victim but did not generate enough suspicion to make him a primary suspect in the 1993 investigation, a failure that allowed him to simply leave the state and continue his violent trajectory on the other side of the country. Over a decade later, the violence that had been dormant in Gargiulo's life since the Picacho murder erupted with a terrifying, focused intensity in Los Angeles, beginning in the early hours of February 21, 2001. When 22-year-old Ashley Ellerin, an aspiring fashion designer and model who was dating actor Ashton Kutcher at the time, was found dead in her Hollywood Hills apartment. Ellerin had been stabbed 47 times in a frenzied, overkill assault that transformed her apartment into a blood-soaked crime scene, an act of such extreme violence that it immediately signaled to investigators that they were dealing with a deeply disturbed, rage-fueled predator who had lost all control during the attack. Kutcher had been scheduled to pick Ellerin up for a date that evening, and when she did not answer her door, he had peered through a window, seen what he believed was red wine spilled on the floor, and assumed she had fallen asleep or was ignoring him, a tragic, innocent misinterpretation of the horrific scene that was unfolding just feet away from him. The investigation into Ellerin's murder was massive, drawing intense media attention due to her connection to a major Hollywood star. But despite the sheer volume of blood evidence left at the scene, the killer had not left a fingerprint, a weapon, or any immediately identifiable clue that could point detectives toward a suspect, and the case slowly went cold. Just 2 years later, on December 1, 2003, Gargiulo struck again, this time even closer to home, murdering 32-year-old Maria Bruno, a mother of 4 who lived in the same apartment building on El Cerrito Place in Hollywood that Gargiulo himself occupied. Bruno was attacked in her bed while her young children slept in the next room, stabbed multiple times in a brutal assault that echoed the sheer savagery of the Ellerin murder, a terrifying escalation that demonstrated Gargiulo's complete willingness to kill within his own building, a level of recklessness that suggested his compulsions were overwhelming his instinct for self-preservation. Once again, the crime scene was awash in forensic evidence, but the killer had vanished into the night, leaving investigators with a terrifying pattern of extreme violence but no name, no face, and no actionable lead, a frustration that was compounded by the glaring, unanswered question of how the killer had gained entry to Bruno's secured apartment building without leaving a trace. The critical break in the case, the moment that would ultimately bring the Hollywood Ripper to justice, occurred not at a murder scene, but during a miraculously failed attempt, when, on April 28, 2008, Gargiulo attacked a 26-year-old woman named Michelle Murphy in her Santa Monica apartment. Murphy was asleep in her bed when she was suddenly awakened by the sensation of being stabbed, and in a moment of sheer, adrenaline-fueled desperation and primal survival instinct, she fought back against her attacker with every ounce of her strength, screaming, kicking, and ultimately forcing the bleeding, panicked Gargiulo to flee through a window and into the night. An escape that left behind a critical piece of evidence that he had meticulously avoided leaving at his previous crime scenes. His own blood. When Santa Monica police arrived at Murphy's apartment, they found a chaotic, terrifying scene, but they also found a trail of the attacker's blood that had been left behind as he fled, a biological calling card that forensic technicians meticulously collected and sent to the crime lab for analysis, a routine procedure that would ultimately unravel a decade-long killing spree. The DNA profile extracted from the blood at Murphy's apartment was run through the National Codes database, but it did not return an immediate hit, as Gargiulo, despite his prior arrests in New Jersey, had never been convicted of a crime severe enough to require his DNA to be entered into the system, leaving investigators with a nameless profile of a would-be murderer and a brave survivor who had narrowly escaped death. However, the miraculous survival of Michelle Murphy provided investigators with something they had never had in the Ellerin or Bruno cases: a living, articulate eyewitness who could describe the attacker, and Murphy provided a detailed description of a man she had seen in the hallway of her apartment building in the days leading up to the attack. A man who had been loitering and staring at her in a way that had made her deeply uncomfortable. Armed with Murphy's description and the unknown DNA profile, detectives began a painstaking, systematic review of the residents and maintenance workers in the area, and they soon zeroed in on Michael Gargiulo, a friendly neighbor who lived nearby and who had a history of violence that, while not severe enough to put him in the DNA database, was deeply concerning and fit the behavioral profile of the killer they were hunting. In June 2008, investigators executed a covert surveillance operation on Gargiulo, following him to a restaurant where he was dining with friends, and after he left the table, an undercover officer collected a glass he had been drinking from, securing a direct DNA sample from the saliva left on the rim. When the forensic lab compared the DNA from the restaurant glass to the DNA recovered from the blood at Michelle Murphy's apartment, the result was an absolute, irrefutable match, providing law enforcement with the scientific proof of Gargiulo's identity as the man who had stabbed Murphy, and instantly transforming him into the prime suspect in the unsolved murders of Ashley Ellerin and Maria Bruno. Detectives immediately obtained search warrants for Gargiulo's residence and his vehicle, and the searches yielded a horrifying cache of evidence, including knives, newspaper clippings about the Ellerin and Bruno murders, and items that demonstrated a deeply disturbing, obsessive interest in the crimes he had committed, a classic serial killer trophy collection that confirmed they had the right man. On June 18, 2008, Michael Gargiulo was arrested by a heavily armed team of Los Angeles Police Department detectives and charged with the attempted murder of Michelle Murphy and the murders of Ashley Ellerin and Maria Bruno, a triumphant moment for the investigators who had spent years hunting a ghost, and the beginning of a grueling, decade-long legal battle to bring him to justice. The legal proceedings against Gargiulo were notoriously complex and drawn out, plagued by numerous delays, changes of venue, and aggressive defense tactics that sought to exploit any perceived weakness in the forensic evidence, but the prosecution's case was an absolute fortress of scientific certainty, anchored by the DNA match from the Murphy attack and the behavioral links between the three crimes. In August 2019, after years of pretrial wrangling, Gargiulo finally stood trial in a downtown Los Angeles courtroom, where the prosecution presented a devastating, methodical case that walked the jury through the terrifying timeline of Gargiulo's crimes, using the DNA evidence, the recovered knives, and the powerful, heartbreaking testimony of Michelle Murphy, who relived the horror of her attack in front of the man who had tried to kill her. The defense attempted to cast doubt on the DNA evidence and suggested that Gargiulo was being framed, arguments that the jury entirely rejected, and after a relatively brief deliberation, Gargiulo was found guilty on all counts, including the first-degree murder of Ellerin and Bruno and the attempted murder of Murphy, a verdict that brought a palpable sense of relief to the packed courtroom. The judge sentenced Gargiulo to death, a sentence that reflected the extreme, calculated brutality of his crimes and the absolute certainty of his guilt, and he was subsequently transferred to death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he joined the ranks of California's most lethal predators. While Gargiulo was sitting in a Los Angeles jail awaiting trial, prosecutors in Illinois, armed with the knowledge of his conviction in California and using the same DNA technology that had secured his conviction in the Hollywood cases, formally charged him with the 1993 murder of Tricia Picacho, finally closing the book on the crime that had started his deadly journey. The case of Michael Gargiulo, the Hollywood Ripper, is a terrifying testament to the incredible danger of the charming, hypersocial predator, a man who weaponized his friendliness and his access to people's homes to hunt his neighbors, and a powerful demonstration of the fact that even the most careful, meticulous killer can be brought down by a single, microscopic drop of his own blood, left behind by a brave woman who refused to die. Number 8. William Talbot II, a quiet truck driver living an unremarkable life in the Pacific Northwest who harbored a dark, decades-old secret behind a facade of total normalcy, a secret that was finally dragged into the light not by a detective's intuition or a witness coming forward, but by the revolutionary, unprecedented application of forensic genetic genealogy that traced a microscopic speck of his DNA back through generations of his own family tree to pinpoint him as the cold-blooded killer of a young Canadian couple. Born on November 24, 1964, in Seattle, Washington, William Talbot II grew up in the working-class, rain-soaked suburbs of the Puget Sound region, an area known for its dense evergreen forests, its rugged coastline, and its brooding, overcast atmosphere, a landscape that would later serve as the silent, indifferent backdrop to one of the most haunting and frustrating murder mysteries in the history of the Pacific Northwest. To everyone who knew him, Talbot was the definition of an average, unassuming American male. He worked a series of blue-collar jobs, most notably as a long-haul truck driver and later as a mechanic, a profession that kept him on the move and allowed him to maintain a low profile in the sprawling, transient communities that line the interstate highways of Washington state. He was described by acquaintances and neighbors as quiet, somewhat introverted, and entirely unremarkable, a man who kept to himself, paid his bills on time, and did not draw any attention to his personal life, a social invisibility that was not a deliberate disguise but rather a natural reflection of a deeply guarded, emotionally flat personality that gave absolutely no outward indication of the monstrous violence he was capable of committing. There was no documented history of violent criminal behavior in Talbot's background, no arrests for assault, no known history of domestic abuse, and no paper trail of psychiatric issues that would have flagged him as a danger to society, a terrifying blank slate that made him the perfect unknowable suspect, a man who simply did not exist on the radar of law enforcement in any capacity whatsoever. The crime that would eventually be linked to Talbot occurred on a freezing, rain-swept day in November 1987, when a young, happy, and deeply in love Canadian couple from the suburb of Saanich on Vancouver Island, 19-year-old Tanya Van Queilenborg and her 20-year-old boyfriend Jay Cook, crossed the border into Washington state for a spontaneous overnight shopping trip to Seattle, a routine, exciting adventure that ended in absolute horror. On November 18, 1987, Tanya and Jay failed to return home as planned, and in the agonizing days that followed, a massive, cross-border search was launched by both Canadian and American law enforcement, a search that yielded a sequence of discoveries that painted a terrifying picture of abduction, violence, and calculated deception. First, Tanya's abandoned 1981 Ford Bronco was discovered in a parking lot in Bellingham, Washington, a city located midway between the Canadian border and Seattle, a find that immediately shifted the focus of the investigation from a missing persons case to a potential abduction and murder. The vehicle yielded a chilling array of forensic clues, including Tanya's wallet, which was found on the floorboard with cash still inside, ruling out robbery as a motive, and a distinctive key to a room at the Nickelodeon Motel in Bellingham, where Tanya and Jay were confirmed to have checked in on the night of their disappearance, a seemingly mundane detail that would later prove to be a critical piece of the investigative puzzle. 2 days after the Bronco was found, the body of Tanya Van Queilenborg was discovered in a ditch near a rural road in Skagit County, Washington. She had been brutally sexually assaulted and shot in the back of the head with a firearm, a violent, execution-style killing that demonstrated a terrifyingly cold and calculated lack of emotion. The following day, the body of Jay Cook was found in a wooded area near a river, miles away from where Tanya's body had been dumped, and unlike Tanya, Jay had not been shot, but had been beaten savagely, his skull shattered by blunt force trauma, a difference in the method of killing that initially led investigators to theorize that the couple had been attacked by 2 separate perpetrators. A theory that would later prove to be entirely incorrect. The dual murders sent a shockwave of fear through the border communities of the Pacific Northwest, a region accustomed to a high degree of safety and rural tranquility, and the investigation, spearheaded by the Skagit County Sheriff's Office and assisted by the FBI, was massive, exhausting every available lead and interviewing hundreds of potential suspects. Semen recovered from Tanya's body during her autopsy was preserved as biological evidence, a standard forensic procedure that, in the pre-DNA era of 1987, could be used to determine the blood type of the attacker but could not be used to positively identify an individual, a technological limitation that left investigators with a biological fingerprint, but no name to attach it to. For over 30 years, the murders of Tanya Van Queilenborg and Jay Cook remained a stubbornly cold case, a painful, open wound for their families in Canada, who spent decades agonizing over the unknown identity of the person who had stolen the future of two vibrant young people, and a frustrating, haunting failure for the detectives in Washington state who refused to give up on the case despite the complete absence of new leads. The investigation was passed down through generations of detectives, each one taking a fresh look at the evidence, each one running the preserved semen sample through the newly developed DNA databases as they became available in the 1990s and 2000s, and each one coming up empty when the profile failed to match any convicted offender in the system. The critical, paradigm-shifting breakthrough in the case arrived in 2018, when the Skagit County Sheriff's Office, unwilling to let the case die with the retirement of its original investigators, made the bold and unprecedented decision to employ the revolutionary, then experimental technique of forensic genetic genealogy. The exact same cutting-edge science that had recently been used to identify the Golden State Killer in California. The preserved DNA profile of Tanya's killer was uploaded by a specialized forensic laboratory to a public genealogy database, a website used by millions of amateur genealogists to trace their family trees through commercial DNA testing kits, a database that, unlike the law enforcement-only CODI system, contained the genetic information of private citizens who had voluntarily submitted their DNA for ancestry research. The genealogical analysis of the killer's DNA did not return a direct match to any individual in the database, but it returned a series of partial matches, individuals who shared enough genetic markers with the killer to indicate that they were distant relatives, specifically third or fourth cousins, a connection that allowed genealogists to begin building a massive, branching family tree that pointed toward a specific set of great-grandparents who had lived in the Pacific Northwest in the late 19th century. By painstakingly mapping the descendants of these common ancestors, using public records, obituaries, marriage licenses, and census data, the genealogists were able to narrow the massive pool of potential suspects down to a single, tightly focused family line, and eventually, through a process of elimination based on age, gender, and geographic proximity to the crime scenes, they zeroed in on one man. William Talbot II. When investigators received the name from the genealogists, they immediately began a deep, covert background investigation into the 53-year-old truck driver, and what they found aligned perfectly with the profile of a man who could have committed the crimes in 1987. He was a white male of the correct age, he had lived in the Puget Sound region his entire life. And he had absolutely no alibi for the dates of the murders. Knowing that the genealogical evidence, while incredibly compelling, was not admissible in a court of law to secure a conviction, detectives needed to obtain a direct, court-admissible DNA sample from Talbot to scientifically confirm the genetic genealogy match. A critical step that required a carefully orchestrated covert operation to secure his DNA without alerting him to the fact that he was under investigation. In the spring of 2018, detectives placed Talbot under intensive physical surveillance, tailing him as he went about his daily routine, and on May 17, 2018, their patience and meticulous planning paid off when Talbot was observed eating a fast food meal in his truck at a rest stop, after he finished and discarded a paper cup and a napkin in a public trash can. An undercover officer immediately retrieved the discarded items, securing a direct sample of Talbot's saliva from the rim of the cup and the crumpled napkin. The forensic laboratory analyzed the DNA extracted from the discarded cup and napkin and compared it directly to the DNA profile that had been recovered from Tanya Van Queilenborg's body in 1987, and the result was an absolute, incontrovertible, one in several trillion match, providing the scientific certainty that William Talbot II was the man who had sexually assaulted and murdered Tanya and beaten Jay Cook to death over 3 decades earlier. On May 20, 2018, just 3 days after the covert DNA collection, William Talbot II was arrested without incident at his workplace in Seattle by a team of detectives from the Skagit County Sheriff's Office, a quiet, unremarkable man taken into custody for one of the most brutal and haunting crimes in the region's history. An arrest that was met with stunned disbelief by those who knew him and overwhelming, tearful relief by the families of the victims in Canada. The trial of William Talbot II began in June 2019 in an Island County courtroom, a venue chosen due to the extensive pretrial publicity in Skagit County, and the prosecution presented a case that was built on the unshakable foundation of the DNA evidence, walking the jury through the 30-year history of the investigation, the groundbreaking genetic genealogy that identified Talbot, and the covert operation that secured the definitive DNA match. The defense attempted to cast doubt on the reliability and the ethics of forensic genetic genealogy, arguing that the science was untested and that the genetic connections were too tenuous to definitively single out Talbot as the killer, arguments that the jury thoroughly rejected in the face of the overwhelming, direct DNA match from the discarded cup. On June 21, 2019, after a relatively brief deliberation, the jury found William Talbot II guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Tanya Van Queilenborg and Jay Cook, a verdict that brought a devastating, 31-year nightmare to a close for the victims' families, who had never given up hope that the killer would be found. The judge sentenced Talbot to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, a sentence that guaranteed the man who had stolen the future of 2 young lovers would spend the rest of his natural life in a concrete cell, stripped of the freedom he had enjoyed for over 3 decades while carrying the secret of his monstrous crime. The case of William Talbot II is a landmark moment in the history of American criminal justice, representing one of the very first successful uses of forensic genetic genealogy in a murder trial. A precedent-setting conviction that definitively proved the legal viability and the incredible investigative power of a science that has since revolutionized the way law enforcement approaches cold cases across the country. For the families of Tanya and Jay, the resolution of the case was a bittersweet victory, a moment of profound relief that the shadow of their loved one's killer had finally been given a name and a face, but also a stark reminder of the 31 years of life, love, and joy that were stolen from them on a cold, rainy day in November 1987, years that can never be returned, a permanent, agonizing cost that Number 9, Earl Bradley, a charismatic, seemingly gentle pediatrician who built one of the largest and most trusted child medical practices in the quiet, coastal resort town of Lewis, Delaware, operating behind a carefully cultivated facade of benevolent care while secretly committing some of the most horrific acts of sexual abuse ever documented in American medical history. His decades-long reign of terror over the most vulnerable patients imaginable finally brought to an end not by a single brave witness, but by the clinical, objective extraction of his own DNA from the hidden, nightmarish evidence locker of his own office. Born on May 10, 1955, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Earl Bradley came from a large, working-class Catholic family, and from a young age, he exhibited an intense, focused interest in the medical field, a drive that led him to pursue a degree in biology and eventually graduate from the Temple University School of Medicine in 1982. An impressive academic achievement that placed him on a path of professional respectability and social trust that he would systematically weaponize over the following decades. Bradley completed his residency in pediatrics at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital, one of the most prestigious medical institutions in the country, and in 1985, he moved to the small, close-knit community of Lewis, Delaware, a quiet coastal town in Sussex County known for its beaches, its historic charm, and its tight-knit, trusting population. A community where a pediatrician was not just a doctor, but a revered and deeply trusted pillar of local life. In Lewis, Bradley established his practice, initially operating out of a small office before building a massive, custom-designed medical complex that became known as Baby's Pediatrics, a facility that was deliberately and meticulously designed to appeal to children and their parents, featuring a massive indoor playground, a miniature movie theater, arcade games, exotic birds, and a sprawling maze of colorful, carnival-like rooms that made the experience of going to the doctor feel like a trip to an amusement park. This elaborate, disorienting environment was not an expression of a doctor who simply loved children, but a calculated, predatory strategy designed to overwhelm the senses of the young patients and to create a chaotic, noisy atmosphere that effectively masked the sounds of distress and prevented parents, who were routinely separated from their children during examinations, from hearing the horrific acts that were taking place behind closed doors. To the parents of Louis, Bradley was a godsend, a savior in a rural area where pediatric care was scarce, a man who always had a smile on his face, who remembered every child's name, who offered flexible hours and walk-in appointments, and who projected an image of such profound, unwavering devotion to the health and well-being of children that the very idea of him being a predator was literally unthinkable to the community he served. Behind this impenetrable wall of professional and social respectability, however, Bradley was operating as a serial sexual predator of staggering, almost incomprehensible scope, targeting his patients, almost exclusively young girls, many of whom were infants and toddlers who were completely incapable of verbalizing the abuse they were enduring or understanding the horrific nature of what was being done to them by the man their parents had entrusted with their care. Bradley's methodology was deeply manipulative and chillingly systematic. He would often insist on examining children alone, separating them from their parents in the maze-like interior of his office, a request that parents, conditioned by decades of medical tradition to defer to the authority of a physician, rarely challenged. Once alone with a child, Bradley would subject them to horrific, repeated acts of sexual abuse, acts that were so violent and extreme that veteran investigators and forensic experts would later describe the evidence in the case as some of the most disturbing they had ever encountered in their careers, a staggering statement from professionals who had spent decades investigating the darkest corners of human behavior. Crucially, and with a cold, calculated foresight that allowed him to evade detection for years, Bradley documented his abuse, using digital cameras and video equipment to record the assaults on his young patients, creating a massive, secret archive of child sexual abuse material that he kept hidden within the sprawling complex of Baby's Pediatrics, a private, digital museum of his crimes that would eventually become the most damning evidence against him. The first rumblings of suspicion regarding Bradley's behavior began to surface in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when a handful of parents and colleagues noticed deeply concerning patterns in his practice, including an unusually high rate of follow-up visits for minor or non-existent ailments, a tendency to perform excessively lengthy and invasive examinations on young girls, and a deeply uncomfortable physical familiarity with his patients that went far beyond the boundaries of standard pediatric care. In 2004, these suspicions culminated in a formal complaint being filed with the Delaware Board of Medical Practice, an action that should have triggered an immediate, rigorous investigation, but instead, the board handled the complaint with a staggering degree of incompetence and institutional negligence, conducting a superficial review that failed to uncover the true, horrific scale of Bradley's crimes and allowing him to continue practicing medicine without any meaningful restrictions. In 2005, following the inadequate board review, Bradley's privileges at a local hospital were restricted, a minor administrative sanction that served as a temporary, easily circumvented roadblock but failed to stop him from continuing to abuse children at his private, unaffiliated clinic, a catastrophic failure of the regulatory system that directly resulted in years of additional, preventable suffering for his victims. The turning point that finally shattered Bradley's facade arrived in December 2009, when a young mother brought her 2-year-old daughter to Baby's Pediatrics for a routine checkup, and during the examination, the mother, acting on a deep, maternal instinct that something was profoundly wrong, pushed past the office staff and opened the door to the examination room to find Bradley in the act of sexually assaulting her toddler. The mother's actions in that single, terrifying moment were an act of sheer, heroic parental instinct that finally broke the spell of silence and institutional protection that had surrounded Bradley for over a decade, and she immediately removed her child from the office, fled the building, and called the police, triggering an investigation that would quickly uncover the full, nightmarish scope of the monster operating in their midst. When detectives from the Delaware State Police arrived at Baby's Pediatrics with a search warrant a few days later, they were met with a scene of almost surreal horror, as they began to navigate the labyrinthine, carnival-like interior of the clinic and discovered a vast, hidden cache of digital recording equipment, computers, and hard drives that contained thousands of hours of video and hundreds of thousands of still images documenting the sexual abuse of Bradley's patients. The sheer volume of evidence was overwhelming, requiring a massive, specialized forensic effort by state and federal law enforcement to catalog and analyze the material, an effort that ultimately identified over 100 individual victims, though investigators acknowledged that the true number of children Bradley abused during his years in practice was likely significantly higher, as many victims were too young to remember the abuse or had not yet been identified in the massive archive of recordings. The forensic analysis of the digital evidence yielded another critical, devastating breakthrough that elevated the case from a purely circumstantial or testimonial prosecution to an airtight, scientifically indisputable case of absolute guilt: the extraction of Earl Bradley's DNA from the evidence he had so meticulously collected. By analyzing the high-resolution video recordings and still images recovered from the hard drives, forensic experts were able to isolate clear, unobstructed images of the perpetrator's face and body, images that, when subjected to advanced facial recognition and biometric analysis, were definitively matched to Earl Bradley, providing an irrefutable visual confirmation of his identity as the man committing the acts documented in the recordings. Furthermore, the forensic technicians were able to extract biological DNA evidence from physical items recovered during the search of the clinic, including towels, clothing, and examination equipment that were visible in the recordings, and when this DNA was analyzed, it was matched directly to Bradley, creating a closed, scientifically perfect loop of evidence that linked him physically, visually, and digitally to the horrific abuse of over 100 children. On December 23, 2009, Earl Bradley was arrested by Delaware State Police and charged with multiple counts of rape, sexual exploitation of a child, and related offenses, a charge sheet that would rapidly expand as the forensic analysis of the digital archive continued to reveal the true, staggering scope of his crimes, sending a shockwave of absolute horror and profound, sickening betrayal through the quiet coastal community of Lewis and the entire state of Delaware. The case of Earl Bradley sent shockwaves far beyond the borders of Delaware, sparking a national conversation about the systemic failures that allowed a predatory physician to operate with impunity for over a decade, and triggering a massive, sweeping investigation into the Delaware Board of Medical Practice, which was widely condemned for its catastrophic failure to act on the early warnings and protect the children who were ultimately abused. In the wake of Bradley's arrest, multiple families filed civil lawsuits against Bradley, his medical practice, and the state medical board, seeking accountability for the devastation that had been inflicted on their children, and the resulting legal and political fallout led to a complete, top-to-bottom overhaul of the state's medical licensing and oversight procedures. A painful but necessary reform driven entirely by the horrifying scale of Bradley's crimes. The criminal trial of Earl Bradley began in June 2011 in a Wilmington, Delaware courtroom, a proceeding that was conducted under a level of security and media scrutiny rarely seen in the state, as the prosecution prepared to present a case built on the most disturbing evidentiary foundation in Delaware's legal history. In a strategic and highly unusual legal maneuver, Bradley's defense attorneys, recognizing the absolute, insurmountable weight of the digital and DNA evidence against their client, chose not to contest the facts of the case, opting instead to focus on issues of mental competency and procedural fairness, a strategy that effectively conceded his guilt but sought to avoid the formal, public spectacle of a graphic trial. The judge, after reviewing the overwhelming evidence, including the hours of video recordings and the definitive DNA matches, found Earl Bradley guilty on all 24 counts of rape, assault, and sexual exploitation of a child that were presented in the indictment, bypassing the jury trial process and moving directly to sentencing. In June 2011, the judge sentenced Bradley to 14 consecutive life sentences plus an additional 164 years in prison, a sentence that was deliberately designed to ensure that he would never, under any circumstances, be released from custody, a mathematical certainty of permanent incarceration that reflected the profound, unfathomable depth of his crimes. The Bradley case is one of the most disturbing in the history of American medicine, a chilling reminder of the absolute, terrifying trust that society places in medical professionals, and the catastrophic, life-shattering consequences that occur when that trust is violated by a predator who has weaponized a medical degree to gain access to the most innocent and defenseless members of the community. Today, Earl Bradley is housed in a maximum security facility, serving his 14 consecutive life sentences in complete isolation, stripped of the medical license, the social respectability, and the unrestricted access to children that he spent decades meticulously cultivating, his legacy not one of healing, but a permanent, horrifying scar on the community he betrayed and the profession he desecrated, brought down not by a single accusation, but by the objective, undeniable truth of his own DNA and the horrifying digital archive of his own making. Number 10. John J. Geoghegan, a quiet, unassuming priest who moved through the parishes of the Archdiocese of Boston with a gentle smile and a collar of authority, using the immense, institutional power and implicit trust of the Catholic Church to systematically prey upon and sexually violate over 130 children across more than 3 decades, his monstrous, hidden reign of terror finally exposed and legally confirmed not by a sudden burst of conscience from within the Church, but by the slow, agonizing, and ultimately undeniable extraction of DNA and biological evidence that shattered a decades-long wall of ecclesiastical cover-ups and forced a global reckoning with an institution that had placed its own survival above the safety of the innocent. Born on June 4, 1935, in the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston, John Geoghegan was the son of Irish Catholic immigrants, raised in a strict, deeply religious household where the Catholic Church was not just a place of worship but the absolute center of family, social, and community life. An environment that instilled in him a profound understanding of the reverence and unquestioning obedience that the faithful afforded to men in clerical collars. Geoghegan entered the seminary at a young age, following a path that was highly encouraged and deeply respected within his community, and he was ordained as a priest in 1962. Beginning a career that would place him in direct, unsupervised contact with generations of Catholic families in some of the most densely populated and fiercely loyal parishes in the Boston area. From the very beginning of his priesthood, Geoghegan exhibited a deeply disturbing pattern of behavior that should have immediately ended his access to children, as he displayed an intense, almost obsessive interest in young boys, particularly those from struggling, single-parent households or families facing financial hardship. A predatory targeting strategy that identified the most vulnerable children whose mothers were likely to be overwhelmed, trusting, and deferential to the authority of a priest. Geoghegan would ingratiate himself with these families, offering to take the boys on outings, buying them gifts, acting as a surrogate father figure, and using his position within the Church to create an environment of absolute trust that prevented the parents from questioning his motives or believing their children when they eventually tried to report the horrific abuse they were enduring. The abuse itself was not a momentary lapse of judgment or a single, isolated incident. It was a relentless, calculated, and highly systematic campaign of sexual predation that involved groping, fondling, and oral rape of boys as young as 4 years old, crimes that Geoghegan committed in rectories, in church sacristies, in the back seats of his car, in hospital rooms where the children were recovering from illnesses, and even in the pews of the churches where they had come to pray, a sheer, breathtaking audacity that was fueled by his absolute certainty that he was untouchable. The most horrifying aspect of the Geoghegan case, the element that elevates it from a story of individual criminal predation to a devastating indictment of institutional corruption, is the undeniable, meticulously documented fact that the Archdiocese of Boston knew about Geoghegan's crimes almost from the very beginning, and instead of removing him from the priesthood and turning him over to law enforcement, they actively, deliberately, and repeatedly conspired to conceal his crimes and protect him from legal accountability. As early as the 1960s, just a few years after his ordination, parents were complaining to their parish priests and directly to the Archdiocese that Geoghegan was molesting their sons, complaints that were received not with shock and outrage, but with a cold, calculated institutional response designed to minimize scandal and protect the financial and reputational assets of the Church. The mechanism of this cover-up was chillingly efficient and deeply cynical. Whenever the complaints about Geoghegan became too numerous or too vocal to ignore, the archdiocese would simply transfer him to a new parish, a process that was cynically referred to internally as shuffling the problem. A geographic sleight of hand that removed Geoghegan from the immediate anger of the victims' families while simultaneously placing him in a brand new community of unsuspecting, trusting Catholics who had no idea that a predator had just been deposited in their midst. Over the next 3 decades, from the 1960s to the 1990s, Geoghegan was transferred no fewer than 6 times, moving from parish to parish across the greater Boston area, leaving a trail of traumatized, shattered children in every single location, a trail of human devastation that was meticulously documented in the archdiocese's own secret internal files. Files that were locked away and guarded with a degree of secrecy usually reserved for matters of national security. The man overseeing this massive, systematic cover-up was Cardinal Bernard Law, the powerful, politically connected Archbishop of Boston, who was personally informed of Geoghegan's predatory nature in the 1980s and who personally approved the transfers that allowed the abuse to continue, decisions that were made with a callous disregard for the safety of children that is almost impossible to comprehend. The legal and investigative breakthrough that finally shattered this decades-long wall of silence did not come from within the Church, but from a team of relentless, aggressive plaintiffs' attorneys who began to systematically chip away at the archdiocese's secret files in the late 1990s, using civil lawsuits to force the Church to hand over the internal documents that proved they had known about Geoghegan's crimes all along. Simultaneously, a team of investigative journalists at the Boston Globe, led by a dedicated group of reporters on the newspaper's Spotlight investigative team, began a painstaking, deeply secretive investigation into the archdiocese's handling of abusive priests, an investigation that would eventually uncover the full, horrifying scope of the Geoghegan case and expose a systemic, institutional cover-up that reached the highest levels of the Catholic Church in Boston. As the Spotlight investigation intensified in 2001 and 2002, the sheer volume of victims coming forward to tell their stories of abuse at the hands of Geoghegan became a tidal wave that the archdiocese could no longer contain, and the secret internal files, which were eventually ordered released by a judge presiding over the civil lawsuits, were published in the Globe, revealing in black and white the cynical, deliberate, and decades-long conspiracy to protect a predator at the expense of over 100 innocent children. While the overwhelming weight of the victim testimony and the damning internal documents were the primary drivers of the public outrage and the institutional reckoning, the specific criminal prosecution of John Geoghegan in the early 2000s also relied, in critical ways, on the careful documentation and analysis of biological and physical evidence that corroborated the victims' accounts and removed any possibility of defensive obfuscation. In the criminal cases brought against Geoghegan by the Massachusetts Attorney General's office, prosecutors were faced with the daunting challenge of building a criminal case around crimes that had been committed decades earlier, in an era before the existence of DNA databases or modern forensic protocols. A challenge that required them to use the available evidence in highly creative and legally rigorous ways to secure convictions. Although the primary physical evidence from the original crimes in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s had long since been lost or destroyed, a critical component of the criminal investigation involved the meticulous forensic documentation of the patterns of abuse, a process that used modern behavioral forensic analysis to establish a definitive, unbroken modus operandi that linked Geoghegan to a massive number of assaults across different parishes and different decades, a behavioral DNA, so to speak, that proved the systemic nature of his predation. Furthermore, in the cases where victims had come forward in the 1990s, before the full scope of the scandal broke, law enforcement had begun to employ the very earliest forms of forensic documentation, including careful medical examinations of the victims by specialized forensic pediatricians who were able to identify and document physical signs of historical sexual abuse, creating a medical record that, while not containing DNA in the traditional sense, provided an objective, scientific baseline that corroborated the victim's testimony. The Archdiocese's own internal files, when subjected to forensic document analysis by investigators, yielded their own form of undeniable evidence. The handwriting of the bishops and cardinals who had approved the transfers, the specific, coded language, almost bureaucratic paper trail of the cover-up itself became a form of institutional DNA that definitively proved the Church's complicity in the crimes. In 2002, as the spotlight stories were exploding across the front pages of the Globe and the world was watching in horror, John Geoghegan was finally brought to trial in a criminal courtroom in Cambridge, Massachusetts, facing charges for the sexual assault of a young boy in the 1990s. A case that was chosen by prosecutors because it was the most recent, and therefore the most likely to yield a conviction under the applicable statute of limitations. The trial was a deeply emotional, intensely scrutinized proceeding, with the prosecution presenting the powerful, heartbreaking testimony of the victim, supported by the forensic medical documentation and the behavioral analysis that demonstrated Geoghegan's lifelong, predatory pattern, a pattern that the Archdiocese's own files confirmed they had known about for decades. In January 2002, the jury found John J. Geoghegan guilty of one count of indecent assault and battery on a child, a conviction that, while only representing a single victim out of the over 100 he had abused, was a monumental, watershed moment in the history of the Catholic Church abuse scandal, as it was the first time a priest in Boston had been criminally convicted for the crimes that the Archdiocese had spent decades covering up. The judge sentenced the 66-year-old Geoghegan to 9 to 10 years in state prison, a sentence that, while widely criticized by the victims and their advocates as being far too lenient for the scale of his crimes, at least guaranteed that he would spend the remaining years of his life behind bars, removed from society and stripped of the ability to harm another child. However, the story of John Geoghegan did not end with his conviction, as on August 23, 2003, while serving his sentence at the Massachusetts Correctional Institution at Cedar Junction, a maximum security prison, Geoghegan was violently attacked and murdered in his cell by a fellow inmate, a convicted murderer named Joseph Druce, who had spent weeks planning the assassination of the priest. Druce, who had a long history of violent behavior and a deep-seated hatred for sex offenders, managed to jam the door of Geoghegan's cell shut, preventing guards from intervening, and then proceeded to strangle and stomp the former priest to death, a brutal, extrajudicial act of violence that, while depraved in its own right, was widely interpreted as a dark, twisted reflection of the profound, unresolved anger that the community felt toward a man who had caused so much devastation. The murder of Geoghegan in prison denied his victims the opportunity to see him serve out his full sentence, a deeply frustrating and painful ending for those who had fought for decades to hold him accountable, but it also permanently cemented his legacy as one of the most reviled and consequential figures in the history of the Catholic Church in America. The legal and investigative fallout from the Geoghegan case was absolutely seismic, triggering a global crisis within the Catholic Church that led to the resignation of Cardinal Bernard Law, the payment of billions of dollars in settlements to victims across the country and around the world, and a fundamental, permanent shift in the way society views and responds to the crimes of sexual abuse within powerful institutions. The Spotlight investigation that exposed the Geoghegan cover-up won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service, the highest award in American journalism, and was later adapted into an Academy Award-winning film, ensuring that the story of the victims and the institutional corruption that protected their abuser would never be forgotten. For the over 100 victims of John J. Geoghegan, the exposure of his crimes and the dismantling of the Archdiocese's cover-up brought a deeply complex mixture of vindication, relief, and profound, permanent sorrow, a recognition that while the truth had finally been dragged into the light, the childhoods that were stolen, the trust that was shattered, and the lives that were irreparably damaged could never be restored. The case stands as a permanent, powerful reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who wear the masks of utmost respectability, and that the institutions that claim to represent the highest moral authority are not immune to the deepest, most cynical forms of corruption, and that the relentless pursuit of truth, whether through forensic science, investigative journalism, or the sheer, unbreakable courage of survivors, is the only weapon capable of tearing down the walls of silence that allow evil to flourish in the shadows.